Really, the two main themes have emerged from this research project I'm doing on Chinese elite thinking on the future. One is that it seems overwhelmingly realist to me when Chinese elites are thinking about international relations, not neoliberal, and also seems to be increasingly offensive realist, or at least risk-tolerant realist. And there seems to be increasing ambitiousness in this way as Chinese power grows, like in the past year and a half or so. But this is the second theme, and it's really what I'm going to concentrate on today. The rise may not continue owing to a combination of deeply intractable economic and demographic problems. Let me start by talking about the demographics, since actually it was in the news just today. The initial results from the 2010 Chinese census are out, and here are a few highlights. First of all, the population only grew by 5.84% over the 2000s, from 2000 through 2009, which is much less than expected. Secondly, the overall labor force, the population and working age, will start shrinking from 2016, just 5 years from now. The number of workers aged 20 to 24 is already shrinking. Third, almost half the population, actually 49.68%, that's pretty close to half, now lives in cities, which means that even if the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, were to relax seriously the one-child policy, it would be hard to reignite population growth, because you know what happens when people move to cities, they have fewer kids. But in any case, Hu Jintao said just on Tuesday that the party was not going to relax the one-child policy. So it's not even on the table. As a result, here's the really amazing thing to me. The U.S. Census Bureau now predicts that China's population will peak in 2026 and then start declining. That's only 15 years from now. And right at that point also, India will surpass China to become the world's most populous country. So how many countries throughout history have been able to sustain a rise when their populations are aging and shrinking? And China will start shrinking when per capita GDP is a lot lower than Japan's per capita GDP when its population started shrinking. Now, on to the interrelated economic problems. First, even before the global financial crisis, banking reform in China ended by about 2007 with the defeat of a reformist faction and internal factional political struggles. So by November 2008, when the CCP ordered the gigantic fiscal and monetary stimulus programs everybody knows about in anticipation of the coming collapse in Chinese exports, the banks had already reverted to Soviet-style banks, essentially making loans at the orders of the Ministry of Finance. This is in the Walter and Howie book, Red Capitalism, if you want to see extreme, almost excessive documentation of this astonishing development. So what this meant after the global financial crisis began is that loans were dished out to wasteful state-owned enterprises, and particularly for often extremely unnecessary infrastructure projects. Not just unnecessary, but extremely unnecessary infrastructure projects, where the dynamic private sector was thrown to the wolves. According to a Chinese Academy of Sciences study released in January 2010, in early 2009, 20% of small and medium enterprises, private enterprises, failed, and another 20% almost failed. And the rest were having increasing difficulty securing finance because of this change in the financial system. This is a good illustration of the Guojin Mintui, the so-called advance of the state, retreat of the private phenomenon that a lot of people talked about in the last couple of years, and itself calls into question the future of Chinese economic elan. How many states have risen when state-owned enterprises that are very wasteful, and state-owned banks that shovel credit to them and don't necessarily have to require those loans to be paid? How many states like that have been the most economically dynamic, or as Professor Kong said, source of the leading technology in the world? But more immediately and concretely, as everyone knows, money and credit growth skyrocketed in China starting in 2009. So if you look at graphs of M2 growth over time, a big bulge suddenly appears in the late 2000s, and it's only receding slowly. Just in the last reporting period, M2 still grew at 16%, which is 7 to 8 points higher than the quarter-on-quarter GDP growth rate, and that's with the People's Bank of China trying hard in a variety of ways to rein the situation in. Growth is now thoroughly dependent on investment, this kind of excessive investment that's very often wasteful, and it's increasingly inefficient, so that now it takes a lot more growth in money and credit to raise GDP by 1 percentage point than it did just 7, 8 years ago. So a lot more credit, a lot more loans being made, money supply expanding, but getting a lot less bang for the buck. So the problem is that, a number of problems here, but one key problem is that property developers and state-owned enterprises now very powerful, and they don't want money and credit growth to slow. They like the current environment in which real interest rates are still negative because inflation is so high now, and they have enormous power because the center, with each passing generation of political leaders, Mao to Deng to Jiang to Hu, becomes weaker relative to these other actors. So the property bubble and now consumer level inflation, which everyone has heard a lot about recently, seem likely to become permanent fixtures, particularly since exporters, who are also very powerful, don't want to see serious renminbi appreciation. So in other words, this kind of property bubble problem and inflation are likely to become permanent fixtures unless the property bubble collapses, which would be worse in many ways, because then it would leave the banks holding mountains of bad debt and would wipe out the wealth of China's highest consuming sectors of the population. This fact, too, would serve as a vicious, nasty black swan, damaging the global economy and, you know, ricocheting across the world, if you can imagine such a beast as that, ricocheting across the world, causing all kinds of problems for China's partners and China back itself. Again, China would not be able to export its way back to super high rates of growth in this kind of world. And of course, its exports were growing at 25% a year by the mid-2000s. Finally, to bring it full circle, if things remain inflationary instead of deflationary, we have the distinct possibility of a wage price spiral taking root, since fewer people of working age means wages will have to rise. And of course, we've already seen that too. And that increases internal political tensions. There was a strike just last weekend by the Shanghai truckers. There's all kinds of job actions like this we see all the time now. This would be naughty, not naughty, K-N-O-T-T-Y, naughty for any political system to deal with. It's going to be really difficult for the kind of authoritarian system that doesn't have the ideological claims, as Professor Kong noted, as others have talked about, that the United States or Japan or another society would.